economic development strategy. And then we will also hopefully have a few minutes reserved at the end of our call for a member roundtable. So I will turn things over to Emma now for her to introduce herself and get her presentation started. So Emma, it's all yours.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emma Berger. I am the Inland Wetlands Section Supervisor in the Wetlands Bureau, and I am here today to share some information regarding the wetlands permitting process and project planning. Before I begin, I just wanted to ask if you all have had any experience in the wetlands permitting process. You can use the reaction tool that's at the bottom of your screen. You could do like a thumbs up or a wave. If you haven't done it before and this process just overwhelms you, you can do a little scared face. And you're welcome to also unmute too if you want to share your experience in wetlands permitting. I'm seeing some head shakes. I see Joe has his hand up. Sounds like he's done some wetland permitting. So it can be a little bit of a mysterious process, especially if you're new to it. And the goal here today is to take the mystery out of it to make it where this process is a little bit clear and that the expectations from DES is clear. This is a presentation that I try to do to share with stakeholders, with certified wetland scientists who may be submitting these permit applications. And we also do in-reach as well as the outreach component so that we maintain a level of consistency. So when I say a wetlands permit, I'm talking about if you are going to touch any kind of soil that's in a wetland area or in a stream, you need a wetland permit. And when that gets submitted, it goes to my team and I review their work. So the key takeaways of today's presentation regarding this wetland permit application process is to provide you information to prevent unnecessary time delays during the permitting process, and so that the department has the information needed to render a decision. So this can be a time-consuming process if that application comes into the department and is missing that necessary information. Here is the outline of what I will be discussing today. So just to give an overview, if you've arrived at this presentation, you're not quite sure what we regulate, I'm going to touch on that just a little bit. And then I'm going to jump into the wetlands permitting, the project planning that's required, the application prep and submittal that's absolutely necessary for that complete application and to prevent the unnecessary time delays, and then the application review process. As I go through the presentation, please feel free to stop me at any point. You can unmute, ask your questions. This is open, and I like to have that dialogue. So please feel welcome to doing so. And you can also put your questions in the chat. If I don't see it, if someone could just jump in and let me know, I'd appreciate it. I might miss it, and it's not because I'm ignoring your question by any means. All right, so why does NHDES protect wetlands in the first place? I'm going to leave this open for you guys. You can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourselves. Let me know, why do you think this is something that is protected? So I'm seeing flood resilience, protect wildlife, natural habitat, handling stormwater, water quality benefits. Wow, you guys are right on top of it. So flood control is the first thing that I put on here. Water quality, wildlife habitat, economic value, believe it or not. Oh, I see another one that just came through, biodiversity. I'm seeing more on natural habitat, stormwater. Wonderful. And the list goes on. There's actually 13 that are identified. We call them functions and values. Value is a little confusing. What that means is an environmental service, the services that the environment provides us. I mentioned economic value. I think this is really interesting. The stats are old here. The data from 2006 hasn't been updated in some time, but in 2006, they identified that a single acre of wetlands amounts to 150,000 to 200,000. So we can assume that that number has probably increased since that study was done. Wetlands also increased surrounding real estate by an estimated 28%. And then finally, in 2002, it was estimated that the remaining wetlands in New Hampshire was worth 1.2 billion. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, NHDES Wetlands Bureau, what we regulate is basically any disturbance to the soil in a wetland or in a stream or the banks of a stream. That's what needs a permit. If you're not touching the banks of a stream, if you're not touching the stream channel, if you're not touching a wetland, no wetlands permit is required. We only come in when you're doing some type of disturbance to that soil. We call it dredge and fill. When it comes to our role in permitting, it boils down to two things: avoidance and minimization. And I'll break down those words just to make sure everybody is on the same page of what I mean by avoidance and minimization. And then secondly, we're looking for the completeness of the application itself. So this is, did you pay your permit processing fee, for example? When I say avoidance, I mean, did you design the project to avoid wetland impacts where it's unnecessary? When I say minimization, I'm saying, did you minimize the wetland impacts that were necessary in the project design to the extent practicable? And by the word practicable, that means that the consideration of cost and technology were factored in. One example that we come across often is wetland crossings. You might have a wetland crossing where a box culvert is incredibly expensive and a round culvert may be more practicable for the applicant to propose. So that's what I mean by those three terms. Here's an example. I'm a very visual person. Here's an example of where something was not minimized or avoided. We have a crossing, it's crossing the stream twice in one area. Here's an example of minimization. So they're only crossing the stream once. And then finally, in this example, it was completely avoided. All right, so now let's move on to the wetland permitting itself. So let's talk about project planning. You know that you need a permit because you know you're going to have to touch some wetlands to do whatever you're proposing to develop. Your step one, when you're looking at properties, retain a certified wetland scientist. I cannot tell you how many times that we get public inquiries where someone calls DES and asks us if we think there will be wetlands on site. We don't know. We have to have someone on site to verify that. And NHDES does not provide that service. You have to retain a certified wetland scientist to go and identify those resources so that you can do the project planning that's needed to avoid and minimize in your design. So here are some steps to the project planning. Top screening will primarily be done by the certified wetland scientist that's been identified. Then they will do the verification on site for those resources. And then when it comes to the project design process, the certified wetland scientist, maybe the engineer, are going to work together to avoid and minimize those impacts in whatever the project is that you're proposing. This is the most important part, and this is why I'm here. When you go in to submit your application showing your project design, it has to reflect avoidance and minimization. Oftentimes when applications are submitted to us, it may be assumed that it should be obvious. We can't assume as technical reviewers. The application has to stand on its own and speak for itself. So there are very essential details that the department needs to render a decision, and to write a permit. And then finally, when the department is able to assimilate that information, then the department can move forward with rendering that decision, hopefully approval. When I say project planning, there is a tool that can be used. It's called the Wetland Permit Planning Tool, and it shows the resources on site. So if you retain a certified wetland scientist, or you can do this yourself by using the tool, you can look at some resources on site. You can pull up some layers of where you're looking. Here's an example of a parcel. Let's say that someone has an easement to access the back end of that parcel that I have shown. And they look at poorly drained soil. So you see there's that brown layer. And then we have a peatland, that's the lime green. That indicates that there may be some resources on site that need to be avoided. They may pull up the types of habitat. This may indicate if you're going to need to coordinate with New Hampshire Fish and Game or the NHB, the Natural Heritage Bureau. You may also look at the National Wetland Inventory map, which you have to take with a grain of salt. Just because it's showing wetlands doesn't mean there's wetlands on site. That's why you have to retain a certified wetland scientist to verify. Sometimes there's no wetlands. Sometimes there's a lot more wetlands. So it's really important to get them involved immediately in the project planning process. All right, so now the certified wetland scientist is going to go on site and verify. So that means they're going to walk that area. They're going to look at the types of resources. You'll notice there are some acronyms, PFO, PEM. That just means the type of resource. Palustrian emergent, so think marsh. Palustrian forested, that's a forested wetland. And that cues in the reviewer as to what kind of functions that we talked about at the beginning. Remember water quality, for example, flood storage. That tells the reviewer what kind of functions are on site. And that is key to avoidance and minimization. The more functions a wetland has, the more that wetland should be avoided or impact should be minimized to the extent practicable. So now let's talk about, so this is the form. When I say wetland functional evaluation, this is what the certified wetland scientist would provide for a minor or major impact project. These sheets are incredibly important. We use this tool to determine if avoidance and minimization has been met. There's also a checklist for avoidance and minimization that can be submitted. However, there are draft rules right now that will be removing this checklist that can be submitted because about 60% of the time, the department requests a narrative because the checklist is not clear how avoidance and minimization has been implemented in the project design. So when you are submitting your wetland permit application, I highly recommend providing a narrative instead of just the checklist because it's not clear to the reviewer what this really means. Okay, so now we have an example. I want you all to take a look at this. We did our project planning. We looked at the parcel. Your certified wetland scientist has gone on site. And we see there's a driveway that's proposed, and it's going all the way to the back end of the property where there is a house. You'll notice there is a septic system beside the house. That's because there are setbacks required. So let's pretend in this scenario, this is the only location they could put the house with the septic system and still be compliant. When you're looking at this, and you know that for a reviewer, you need to be achieving avoidance and minimization, what are the first things that would jump out at you here? Take a moment, look at this. Notice that we've got wetland 1, We have the principal functions and values identified. So these are the primary means of how the wetland is functioning. Wetland 2 has one that's been identified. You can put it in the chat, you can unmute. What's something that's jumping out at you here?
It
So
seems like they're both impacting more wetland area than they need to, and also higher value wetlands than they need to, than if they just went through that PFO area.
Yeah, so James really hit it. And I also see that Karen put crossing over several wetlands. That's exactly correct. You are impacting in this scenario more functions and values of those wetlands than if you were to just impact the pedestrian forested wetland that's to the right. Notice that there is only one principal function that identified, which is the groundwater recharge, versus wetland number 1, which identifies 3 functions. So if you're the reviewer and you only received that checklist that I showed you, it's not clear. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's a completely logical reason behind it, but it's not clear to me. And it sounds like it's not clear to you guys either. This would be more ideal. This is what the reviewer would expect. We know that avoidance is not possible because they need to reach the back end of the property, and you have a right to access upland developable areas on the property. So where avoidance cannot be achieved, minimization is next step. And we're not just talking about the footprint of impacts. We're talking about the impact to functions. So this example would be more ideal because there is less impact to the functions and values on that site. So I have a few examples of how you may avoid and minimize when it comes to project design. So for avoid, I'm talking about you're trying to avoid fragmenting wetland habitat and corridors at the beginning. A couple of you identified wetland habitat as a function and value of wetlands. This is something that technical reviewers assess for. We're also trying to limit the number of crossings. So Karen put in the chat earlier, they were crossing over several wetlands. That's exactly correct. We want to limit that as much as possible because the department cannot approve an application that is not achieving avoidance and minimization. This is in rule. We can't do it because we would be violating the rules that we have to operate under. When it comes to minimization, this is about, I see this often, especially with commercial developments, the sizing of the impervious surface for that parking lot. Is it necessary? Can it be maybe smaller? Can it be rearranged or transposed to where you're minimizing that impact to the extent practicable? And if not, and most often when projects come in, they've gone through rigorous redesigns, but it's not explained in the application. And the technical reviewer has to ask for that information. Make it as clear as possible the amount of work that was put into redesigning this and why this design is the most ideal when it comes to avoidance and minimization. So make sure impacts are located in existing disturbed wetland areas. That's something technical reviewers would ask for. Make sure that the report talks about disturbed areas and locate the impacts away from high functioning wetlands. So I mentioned earlier that avoidance and minimization, if your application is not reflecting that, the department cannot approve it. This is the rule I am referencing. It's in our rule series, ENVWT 31303. It is the keystone to wetland permitting. If your application is not reflecting this, the department cannot approve that application. So make sure that this is crystal clear to that technical reviewer. So I have an exercise for you all. I want to ask you, I want to put your skills to practice now of what we've talked about. We had an example a few seconds ago, so now I want to try your hand at it again. We have this proposed driveway. We have a wetland that is being crossed, and then we have a proposed house in an upland wooded area. What are some issues here? Multiple wetland crossings. Yep, Vanessa got that right. One other thing too is that we have this intermittent stream as well, which is an issue. We also don't know if there are culverts, for example. How is this going to be crossed? What's the sizing of that culvert? There's language in our rules about hydrologic connectivity. Basically, are you going to flood other people from the crossing that's proposed? We saw an application recently where there was an intermittent stream that was relatively close to an adjacent property, and the sizing of that crossing was not sufficient. The department can't approve that if it's not sized correctly, and that goes with avoidance and minimization and also public interest. So another thing, I see that Vanessa said the design of the home and access not known. So yeah, so this is where it gets tricky about the design of the home. You know, we're kind of limited on how much we can ask for that. We have to assess based on need, and need can be subjective. So if they need their home to be a certain size for whatever reason, we're limited in what we can say. But the department can request the location. Why is it located there? Why is the driveway not just going through the wooded upland area to begin with? I see Scott has a question. What happens if there is area on the property where a driveway could avoid wetlands, but the planning board approves a plan that disturbs the wetland? Absolutely. So we come across that sometimes, not all the time, but it does sometimes happen where something may have been approved by the town, but that does not mean that they don't have to provide project plans that have to meet our rules. So state requirements are state requirements, regardless of what the town ordinances are, what the municipality said. We still have to go off of what our rules say. Great question. And it goes the other way too, where maybe it doesn't get approved by the town until they've incorporated wetland buffers. But the state does not regulate wetland buffers. You are not required to include wetland buffers in your project plan design. Vanessa has a question. For our plans, we require NHDES approval before plans are final. Here is what the design would look like if you have a proposed driveway. In this case, they're just crossing the stream. I would want to know more information why they couldn't just cross the wooded upland and completely avoid impacts altogether. But that information would be absolutely necessary in the application, because wetland permit applications are subject to be appealed by abutting properties, conservation commissions, and if that application can't stand on its own, then the permit decision can be reversed. So it's really important that that application can stand on its own and all the information necessary for the department to approve is there. Here's an example where it shows a wetland setback. Again, this is not something that NHDES would regulate. We only regulate direct impacts. Direct meaning that soil disturbance, and that's it. So that's important to keep in mind when you're designing things. So what are some things that are jumping out at you here in this project design? Yeah, so Vanessa says minimize impact. It looks like they could probably minimize the impact to the wetlands. This is also a wetland complex. We have a forested wetland and an intermittent stream. So we're probably going to have more functions and values associated with this wetland. Anything else? Any suggestions if you were designing this? What would you do? What about setbacks from the pond? Interesting. So again, for the Wetlands Bureau, we don't have setbacks. AOT is different, but That would not be something that we would directly assess. We may ask something about how are you maintaining hydrologic flow? Is it going to be impacted from the development of this pond? If that pond was right next to that wetland, there would be a concern about how that wetland may be hydrologically functioning. So what are the water levels? If you dig a pond, water's probably going to flow to the lowest elevation, right? So we have to look at wetlands and how they could be impacted when it comes to dewatering. That's a little more nitty gritty, but this project design in general, is it possible to just completely avoid the impacts to begin with, right? We have these units that are proposed outside of the wetland. If so, this would be ideal because then you don't even have to go through NHDES wetlands permitting in the first place.
So for something like that, because I was going to ask about that, like how much would they need to do to prove that they needed those back 3 units? Are you getting into, is this project cost feasible without those, or is that all sort of, okay, the only way to make this pencil is, and just sort of walk through that in their narrative?
Yeah, that is exactly it. You got it. So they would walk through that in their narrative where they're justifying the need for those additional units.
Okay.
Great question. So that is a great segue because the application prep needs to reflect that. You need those additional units. Make sure it is clear to that reviewer. Otherwise, they're going to ask you. So when you are preparing that application, you need to make sure you're getting the impact classification correct. Ideally, the certified wetland scientist would do this, but I'm sharing it with you today because this could be a setback in your project. So there are 3 classifications: minimum, minor, and major. When it comes to incorrectly classifying a project, this basically requires an entirely new application form. And there are additional steps that are required for the project to be complete. This is the biggest setback when something is applied as a minimum impact project and it's truly a minor or major impact project. Here's generally the classifications. This is a good rule of thumb, and it goes based off of the square footage or linear feet of impacts. We have on, this is a table that you can find in our rules. It's an ENVWT 400 rule series. And you'll see other than a water course, this just means wetlands. And if you're impacting less than 3,000 square feet, generally that will be a minimum impact project. There are exceptions, and I'll talk about a couple. Minor impact, you're falling between that 3,000 and less than 10,000, and then anything more than 10,000 would be major. You'll see for water courses, so in the examples that I provided previously, we saw some intermittent streams, for example. If you're impacting more than 50 linear feet, for example, that would be minor. So that's the rationale behind the table there. There are adjustments, though, that are based on the resource type. If you're impacting a perennial stream, for example, or a marsh, or a scrub shrub wetland that's right next to that stream, now we're talking about a minor or major potentially impact project. And I've had a number of projects that have been submitted as minimum impact projects that got upgraded and drastically changed that processing. Major, if you're impacting a special resource. So right now we call something a priority resource area. And this could be a floodplain wetland adjacent to a tier 3 stream, for example, a bog. So these are priority resource areas that automatically get classified as major, and compensatory mitigation is generally required for those. So let's talk about the review process. Oftentimes when I present on this, people ask, before they submit an application, how long is this going to take me? When can I expect my project to get permitted? And that depends on that application completeness. There are different kinds of permits. We have SPNs, statutory permit by notifications. That's a 5-day review time. probably not applicable to you because these are for recreational trails, timber harvesting, culvert repair. Permit by notifications, these are more project specific. Think residential home, driveway crossing only one type of resource. We have expedited permit applications. Those are minimum impact projects, and they have a 30-day time review if signed by the Conservation Commission. And then finally, this is probably the most applicable to you, standard permit applications. These have a 50-day time review. That means if you submit to the department a complete permit application, it's going to go through first administrative completeness review. That's a 10-day processing, and then a 50-day technical review period. Now, if that application is complete, you can assume that you're going to get your application by the end of that technical review. But if it is not, then that's going to add more time delays. The whole purpose of these presentations is to try and assist you to providing a more complete application, because it is an ideal situation for everyone involved, NHDES, the applicant, the agent, to receive that complete application and the department be able to render that decision upon the completeness of that review. This is what often happens. Something goes through technical review and it's determined that the department cannot render decision. Maybe because they didn't explain why they needed those 3 additional units. We have to ask for that because we have to justify the decision in our permit. We have to make a finding. And once that request for more information goes out, I'll also refer to it as RFMI in this presentation. That RFMI goes out, and then there is a 60-day time period for that agent or applicant to respond. I see Paul has a question. Of the total number of applications submitted in a year, how many are considered complete on the first review? Only 40%, a little less than 40%. Over 60% of projects receive a request for more information letter. Good question. So the majority of these projects are receiving a request for more information because that keystone that I talked about, that avoidance minimization piece, is not sufficient for the department to write that permit, or because we don't even know sometimes where the impacts are located in the first place. And I'll give you some examples of what that may look like. So if your question is, how long will it take? Well, if your application is missing some of this key information, look at this. I mean, look at the flow here. It's there's a lot of steps involved. Once that RFMI is sent out and we receive a response, then it's a technical review period of 30 days. And that's assuming that every single question was addressed. Sometimes questions aren't addressed or not even answered in the first place. So every question in a request for more information letter needs to be addressed. So what is happening? Why are we going through all these steps? Why are we not receiving these complete applications? And I can answer that. I took a look at requests for more information letters from December 30, 2020 to December 5, 2022 for standard wetland permit applications, and almost 200 RFMI letters were assessed. Let me ask you guys, what do you think were the most common comments in those letters that needed to be addressed?
Explain your avoidance and mitigation or
Yeah.
minimization.
Yep, that's the key one. And there's one other, more plan details. If we don't know what we're looking at, if we don't know where the impacts are, the department can't determine that avoidance and minimization has truly been met. So 43% of those letters requested for more plan details. 34% requested for maps and attachments. And then you'll see something kind of odd here. Well, you'll see 2 things that are odd. One is that there's 24% that requested avoidance minimization, and then 18% requested demonstration of avoidance and minimization. The reason why it's broken out that way is because these letters were assessed by the rules that were referenced, And avoidance and minimization is referenced in two separate areas of our rules, in ENVWT 311 and ENVWT 31303. So this means that the reviewers referenced one or the other, or sometimes both. You'll also notice that this adds up to more than 100%. That's because often these rules were cited together in letters. So project plan details and avoidance and minimization may have been referenced twice or more. When we break down those 43% of requests for more information letters specific to the project plan details, this is what comes back. The most requested, labeled or lightly shaded or stippled areas showing the impact areas. This is number one, hands down. If you asked any of our reviewers without them seeing this data, they would tell you that. I cannot tell you how many times we receive project plans and we don't even know, is this a permanent impact? Is this a temporary impact? What impact is this to which resource? And not only do we need that for avoidance minimization, we need that to make basic writings in our permit. In our permit description, we write dredge and fill X amount of square feet of this jurisdictional area that is permanent or temporary. So that is just the most basic information we need to write a permit. Second is the existing and proposed contours. So if you're filling a wetland area to put in a crossing, for example, what's the extent of that? And that has to do with the impact areas and avoidance and minimization. And then finally, the proposed methods of erosion control. Again, avoidance and minimization. How are you going to be keeping your work site clean and not impacting adjacent areas? It all boils down to 2 points. What and where are the impacts, and how have they been avoided and minimized? Here's an example. When I say shaded or lightly stippled areas on the wetland project or on the project plans, this is what that would look like. We've got a roadway that's crossing. We have a palustrine emergent marsh. We have a palustrine forested wetland. These are two resource types that are being impacted. Notice on the plans that it both quantifies the impacts and shows exactly where those impacts are. This is what the department means when they request for that information in a letter. This is what we are looking for when I say existing and proposed contours. The lightly gray areas are the existing contours, and the dark blue area is the proposed contour. This tells the reviewer where the impact area is, and that it matches what's being shown in that shaded area. This is a big one. We see this a lot. Look where the erosion control devices are shown, and then notice where the impact areas are identified. What's the issue here?
Installing or removing those erosion control devices would be a temporary impact.
Yes, exactly. So the temporary impacts are not identified, right? We only have the permanent impacts identified. We have to know the temporary and the permanent impacts because we have to, one, write that, but two, that gets factored into the permit processing fee as well. And this would ideally be where they would place the erosion control devices. They would place it along where the work is proposed, because that can be minimized. One other problem that I see is that the square footage of streams are typically not shown in project plans, and we need that to be shown. Normally only the linear feet is provided, and we need both. This is where it would be shown on the application. So this is the standard wetland dredge and fill application, square footage, linear feet for all streams. And then we have to have the banks also identified for perennial and intermittent streams. So the key takeaway here is to, one, prevent the unnecessary time delays, avoid and minimize impacts, reflect avoidance and minimization in your application, and clearly identify those wetland impacts. And then two, make sure that you're providing that complete application to decrease the technical review period. And one thing that I did want to hit on today is that the department is aware that we can improve to clarify the things that we need in our application process. And there is a draft rule that is out there now that you can go and comment on. And a couple of things that have been included in that draft revision is one, the reorganization of the rules. So I mentioned earlier, there's two different places where avoidance and minimization is referenced, EMVWT 311 and EMVWT 31303. Now that's in one single area so that it can be seen by people that pick up that rule set. There's a few other things too. That checklist that I mentioned earlier. So the checklist doesn't really tell us anything on how it's been avoided and minimized. It would not explain why those 3 units are needed and how you've avoided and minimized those impacts. That's going away, and it's proposed that only a narrative be provided. There will also be not a fact sheet, but a sheet that's provided with the application package that's proposed, where it requires the applicant to clearly specify the impacts and to which resources. That's to help the reviewer understand the plans, assimilate that information, and write that permit. There's a number of other changes as well, but just so that you're aware, that is happening. The rule set is under review, and it is for the purpose of trying to clarify this process so that the department can receive that complete application and process without needing a request for more information letter. If you are going through the project planning process, we do have different regions in New Hampshire that are assigned to the technical reviewers in the Wetlands Bureau. You can scan this QR code. It will show you the map if you need to see the breakdown of where these regions are. But these are the contacts that you would reach out to, and they have more specialized knowledge of these regions. We ask that you stay in touch with us. This is an email that you can use. We also have a phone number and a QR code if you want to reach out to our social media. And we're happy to take any of your questions. We have an inspector of the day that responds to public inquiries. And we also have a survey that we would love to hear from you guys. I wanted to leave some time for questions. I see that Vanessa put in the chat, can you share the presentation to the group after? Yes, we can share the presentation. It'll need to go through review through Rochelle's team, but after we have that reviewed, then we'll share. Any other questions? Yeah.
Emma, I am wondering if you have links to the survey for folks to provide feedback. I just tried scanning it on my phone on the screen here, and it doesn't seem to be working for me.
Oh,
QR
thank you.
Code.
Thank you for bringing that up. Rochelle, do you happen to have a link handy that you could put in the chat?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Do folks have any questions or things they'd like to share or ask of Emma while we have her on the call today?
I'm just curious. You've got the proposed rule change, and you've talked about the narrative and completing the providing as many details as possible in the application. Do you anticipate a decrease in that number of requests for more information? Do you have a number in mind that you're trying to get to, or what are your thoughts on what kind of progress you'd see by this rule change and other feedback that you're getting?
Yeah, great question. I don't think we have a percentage goal in mind. I think it's just to try and decrease that 60% as much as possible. But from what I understand, the department has been decreasing the amount of requests for more information somewhat recently. And some of that has to do with the technical reviewers' experience. From what I understand, a few years ago, the technical experience, I think, was 1 year. So those technical reviewers are still on board with us. and are gaining experience and knowledge on the job. That's one aspect. Two, we are doing quite a bit of outreach, especially this year, in providing this information to try and assist the public. And I think with that rule package that's proposed, I think that will significantly help, because the information that's most commonly requested is being addressed in that draft rules of by providing those worksheets that is required by the applicant and agent. So we'll see. I'll hopefully I'll be back to share those numbers with you all.
Wasn't there something in the presentation that we saw back at the office a few weeks back? You mentioned something about a signature required. Is there a signature required by a scientist or an engineer or something like that?
Yeah, good. So I think you may be thinking of stream crossings.
Possibly.
And if there's a tier 2 or tier 3 stream crossing, so more than 200 acres of a watershed for a stream area, you do have to have a professional engineer stamp those plans.
Okay. That's what it was.
And you might also be thinking about, this is a really good point, you have to have a certified wetland scientist stamp project plans in general for a wetlands permit if there's a wetland. If it's just a stream only, you do not need a certified wetland scientist. Great question. Another reason why you need to retain that certified wetland scientist as soon as possible in that project design process. I see a question from Robert. What about opponents of the permit? Who can object, when, and how? Yeah, good question. So abutting properties, Conservation Commission, the LAC, Local Advisory River Council, those are people that can oppose permits that are under review. And that is why it is so essential for the applicant and agent to address those comments as soon as possible. And the comments that need to be addressed are the ones that pertain to our statute and rules. Sometimes we get comments that for things that we don't regulate. If we don't regulate it, there's nothing that we can do that doesn't need to be addressed. But if it's something that we do regulate, such as avoidance and minimization, we have to have a response, and we actually include the response in our permit write-up if the permit is approved or denied. The department is required by statute in RSA 482A to address those comments. So that's what I mean when I say the application needs to stand on its own, because if it goes through that appeal process, we need to have everything in there to make it a strong permit.
Can you speak a little bit to sort of order of operations for these projects? Because for almost all of these kinds of things, there's also some sort of local review happening. And so I've been that person that has staffed the planning board. Now I'm sitting on Dover's technical review committee. And sort of talking through with applicants, sometimes they'll want to wait until after they're through city technical review to know if we have comments that would change what they send to you. But then also I've seen projects that wait until like the very end to submit to you, and that's just you're putting your timeline about as far after ours as it could go, and making the permit take as long as possible. So I don't know if you have ideas about like the best way to have some of these processes happening in parallel, or how to resolve like if the option is avoidance or minimization of wetland, but in order to do that, they would need local relief for setbacks and they can't get it. How to balance those two things.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky, like you said, on what point do you do this? Because if they need a wetlands permit, they might also need an AOT permit. They might need a subsurface permit. There are so many things that they need from the state level, let alone the local level. And I think what you said there is the key, the avoidance and minimization aspect, and then making sure that it's meeting some of those local ordinances that the state does not regulate. Like I mentioned, the state does not regulate wetland buffers, but there are many areas on a local level that do. So it does get tricky if they come in through the wetland permitting process and they don't have those wetland buffers, but from a local perspective, they need that, and they don't realize that, that's going to completely change their project design process. And I think understanding what the state regulations are, especially how important it is when it comes to avoidance minimization, is really key. But when we get involved, it's really just up to them on when they're going to submit that application. We do have a pre-application process that anybody is welcome to use. It's really a customer service. We have in our rules right now, you are required to have a pre-application for mitigation. If you are going to need mitigation, you have to come into the department before you submit. But that requirement under draft rules will go away, because oftentimes when they come in for the pre-application, they don't know what they're going to submit for their package. But pre-applications will continue to be offered for anybody who wants them. And they're welcome to bring others along too for that. So I don't have a great answer for you. I think it just really depends. I see that, I think Paul asked a question. You mentioned about the experience of the application reviewers. Yes, we are fully staffed right now. The Wetlands Bureau is fully staffed. And since I've been the inland section reviewer, we have not had any turnover. And thank you, Miguel. I think he already jumped off, but thank you for letting me know I did a good job. Did anybody have any other questions? Thank you, Paul. I haven't been inland section supervisor for too long, to be transparent, but hopefully I'll keep that going as I continue to work at DES.
That was a fantastic presentation, Emma. So thank you for that. I learned quite a bit, and I think that a lot of the tips you shared about the process for these applications were really, really valuable to folks on the call. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If folks do have additional questions that come up for Emma, we will share out that email address that was at the end of the presentation for any inquiries or questions. So that contact information will be shared out after this call, in addition to presentation recording and notes from today. The one thing that we have on the agenda that I mentioned at the start of this call before Emma began presenting and before we get into our brief opportunity for a member roundtable is just a short, quick announcement from SRPC. So we are in the process, we have just started the process internally of doing the final 1-year update to our CEDS, our 2021 through 2025 CEDS. So we are internally in that process now. We will be reaching out to contacts in communities about project solicitation soon. And one of our future CEDS calls will act as the strategy committee for our CEDS 1-year update. So we will be doing a presentation about economic trends and data. And we will also be soliciting and asking for some feedback from folks on the call on the strategy committee as well too, to help guide this 1-year update process. So more information.
Did we lose Mike?
Did I drop again? Am I back?
Oh, you're back.
Okay, I apologize. During the Q&A section, and I had to tether to my phone, internet problems at the absolute most opportune times. That's when they usually happen. So for the sake of not repeating myself, that's our CEDS 1-year update. More information to come, and we look forward to working with folks on the strategy committee at a future call to share some information and gather some feedback. Now, I think we have just a few minutes to open it up to a member roundtable. So if folks have anything they want to share that they're seeing in their communities, projects that they're working on in their communities or throughout the region that they'd like to get feedback on from the whole group, or just share what's been happening, feel free to come off mute and jump on in. Yeah,
So I
Jen.
wanted to let everyone know, because our regions do overlap. The REDC is actually starting its 5-year SEDS. We're starting that. We're in the process right now. And we are going to be having some public visioning sessions that even if you're not in our immediate region, we would love for you to join us. The information will be coming out in a flyer, but I just wanted to put it out there that we'll be meeting in Nashua, February 19th. So I know that's a little bit far away, but we're going to be doing an event with John and the Chamber on March 6th in Hampton at the Galley Hatch, and that's an evening event at 5 o'clock. So again, that'll be an opportunity to come, voice your opinion, meet some people, things like that. And we'll also be doing a virtual event on March 19th if you cannot come to the in-person event. So again, I'll be sharing that information, and SRPC will probably help share that information to you all. And so if you have questions, just please feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Yes, we will definitely share that information out in our email after this call. Joe, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I was just going to say that in Durham, they're moving forward with the EDGE RFP with the University of New York.
Joe, it looks like you went on to mute.
Sorry, it's quite an economic development project right at the intersection of Route 4 and Main Street, where they're talking about a big building for National Oceanographic and Aerospace, possibly a patent office and some housing. Also, Durham is looking at changing a number of their zoning codes to allow more housing and perhaps denser within Durham. And Durham has also already passed an ordinance with a workforce, or I think attainable housing, they call it, overlay zone. And there's a particular 100-acre piece that was identified, as well as what people may remember as Goss Manufacturing is now called 121 Tech Center. So that's what's happening in Durham right now.
Great. Thanks, Joe. John?
Yeah, thanks. And I apologize for not being on these calls as much as I should, but I just wanted to take a minute and share some long overdue good news. With the help of Darren, my buddy over in Exeter, we are creating a foundation here in the Seacoast area to build an economic development regional strategy plan for 5 communities from Rye all the way down to Seabrook. That foundation is going to be kicking off an idea of where we will be hiring an economic development professional out of the chamber here, and then loaning that person out to some of our community towns that do not have economic development professionals on their staff, and to highlight the importance of economic development with the idea that by loaning that person out for a 2-year period of time, it will show justification, such as the same thing that Darren showed in Exeter. So we're all excited about that. And as a matter of fact, we've already applied to the New Hampshire CDFA for some grant money under the, their grant programs. So I'm excited to share that, because I know that we have been disappointed down here in the southern part of the Seacoast not to be as strong as you all are up in Stratford County. We need to be as strong around economic development as you all are. So I'm excited about sharing this news to you. Thanks.
That sounds like a fantastic initiative and opportunity, John. So thanks for sharing that. Any other folks want to jump in and share things that are happening in their worlds before we go our separate ways for the rest of the day? James?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out real quick, wearing my Workforce Housing Coalition hat for a second. Emily Ham is our new executive director, and she's on the call today. So, Emily, if you want to say a quick hello to the group.
James, hi everyone. Nice to see you all. Nice to meet you. I'm excited to work with you, and As James said, I'm the new executive director, and we'll be attending these meetings and working with all of you in other capacities, I'm sure. So
We're happy to have you here, Emily. Great to meet you, and we look forward to working with you as well.
thanks.
Awesome. Last call for any things folks want to share before we jump off. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. It was a very, very robust and interesting call hearing from the folks at New Hampshire DES and hearing from you all during this roundtable. So thank you all. And we will be sharing more information out in our follow-up email, which Natalie will send. And we look forward to working with you all for our CEDS 1-year update at future meetings. Great. Thank you,
Good to see
everyone. Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.